Panelists, I think Michael Jennings, President and CEO of Forest Trends, and Tony Simons, the Director General of the World Agroforestry Center, or ICRAF.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you guys, GLF, for doing this. It's a great initiative, a great thought, a great frame for us to be kind of continuing to evolve our thinking. And I wanted Jen to really thank you, and what a nice breath of fresh air. And I love the way you were saying, let's have these honest conversations. And I wanted to kind of continue down that path. And I wanted to think about three things in my mind that that have been a part of the last 30 years or so of my my work in this space. And one is sort of pace, one is scale, and then the third one is the theme that we're working on today, and we've started to explore more, which is stitching. You know, how do we pull these pieces together? You know, I think they're all really important. So in terms of pace, you know, if we really believe all of the scientists that are telling us that, you know, climate is accelerating and it's causing all these problems, if anybody here has not had that an experience with climate like that, please come and talk to me later. But the loss of biodiversity, the loss of forests, all of these things, that the continuous drumbeat that we've been hearing for the last several decades. And then to think about where we are in terms of responding to that. 20 years ago, in 1999, I wrote a piece which was about capital markets and sustainable forestry. It still is very relevant today, unfortunately, 20 years later. In 2000, some of you will remember from the World Bank, we had a tropical forestry investment forum at the World Bank. Big deal, big room, you know, 1,000 people all talking about the same issue. So we have been working for, you know, 3 decades trying to address this issue so far, and I'd argue that we have not made much progress. We do have a unique moment, you know, when I'm always an optimist, and I'm thinking that, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals have a lot more traction than the Millennium Development Goals did. So there really is a window there we can be thinking about. And the Paris Accord and all the NDCs, all the commitments that countries made around forestry are some very big windows that we can be working through. But they will also close. And I hope we don't have this meeting 10 years from now and are talking about the similar things we've been talking about over the last 3 decades. So pace is really important. And I think we need to have that real conversation with ourselves and with our friends to say, are we really acting in the bold way we need to resolve these problems? We're sort of stuck in our institutions, we're stuck in our ways, and I would say we are not moving nearly as quickly as we need to. Scale. So the challenge of thinking about, and Jen, you mentioned this, from moving from ad hoc project support to something that is a much larger scale, is about, in my mind, it's about creating an asset class. You know, when you can start thinking about tropical forestry as an asset class, that's when you start to get to scale. But it means that we need to move from, you know, we need to start to get into portfolios of $250 million that people can invest in. You think about a large pension fund, for instance, and obviously these are the institutional investors we want to bring to the table with us. They need to look at something that's got $100 million, a $500 million investment opportunity, and they only want to be one of the many investors. So we need to start to think about moving from individual projects into these larger frames, and Jen, I think you were speaking this too, that starts to create this idea of an asset class. There are a number of people in this room and that have been in this space for a long time that are truly pioneers. I think of Dave Brand and New Forest. I think of Althelia that's here. My good friend Tashka Yawanawa in the back there. that are all pieces of that puzzle and that have been pushing in their own ways in this space. But we need to kind of rally around them and make their enterprises not just one-off projects, but we need to create that bridge into what we would call kind of an asset class. And that's going to take, in my mind, it's not a short journey. We use the example of renewable energy, and I certainly remember when microenterprise was a new phenomena, and I remember when renewable energy in the Carter administration here was something that had to require heavy subsidies for a long time before it became really investable. So I think we need to have a 10-year horizon around this. We need to be thinking about, if forest and land use become real asset classes, it's going to be an adventure of another 10 years.
Michael, can I ask you to finish here?
Yeah, and I guess so. The last thing would be stitching, and for me, it's great. It's about landscapes, and the stitching is, let's think about a future where we have a dozen new forests, a dozen althelias, and when the MDGs and the DFIs are deliberately investing in that kind of a future, saying we want to invest in new investors that can do it. Let's not forget the other side of the equation, which is the communities, the local communities, the indigenous communities that are managing these lands already. Let's take advantage of these ideas of sustainable supply chains to support what they're doing. There are sustainable forest-based supply chains around things like Brazil nuts, acai, artisan crafts. Let's double down and invest in those so the forest side of that equation has real value. As many of you know, what we do at Forest Trends and have been trying to do for 20 years is building out these new environmental markets that are going to make these forests and landscapes that much more valuable. So stitching, really important.
Thank you. I was about to ask a question before you start, but you start off faster than me. But I will ask the question to Tony because I know that he's never averse to a sort of a good question. So we seem to have all the commitments. Jennifer tells us that we have the tools. I mean, it's sort of, we don't necessarily need to talk all the time about innovation. We have the political will. We have a huge need out there. And why is it not happening?
I agree with Michael. No, first of all, allow me to thank the organizers. I mean, this is a fantastic convening of experts. It really is brilliant. And the opening remarks by Robert and also Laura from the World Bank, Jennifer, just really set the stage. And we've got two bookends of this problem. And I think if you look at the wonderful wallpaper of logos on the left-hand side there, we've got a lot of NGOs, we've got a lot of donors, and we've got a lot of financiers. But we're kind of missing the middle, and that's the real issue. So for every $1 of development, and we think development's the solution, for every $1 of ODA, there's 20 cents of philanthropy, institutional philanthropy, 40 cents of individual philanthropy, $3 of remittances, $6 of FDI, $24 of domestic country private sector spend, $35 of government spend, and $1,000 of private capital. And if we're just going to be thinking about the philanthropy and ODA end and the capital end and miss out that middle, so we need all of the Consumer Good Forum on that chart as well to make the business case for landscapes. And what are these landscapes? Well, we've got 4.1 billion hectares of forest. We've got 2.8 billion hectares of rangeland and pasture, 1.9 billion hectares of desert, 1.5 billion hectares of cropland, 1.3 billion hectares of wetland, and about 300 million hectares of municipal metropolitan area. Now, the problem is with wetland, I mean, deserts don't have a value, much of a value, but the problem with wetlands and forests, where much of this work and our activity is, it's unremunerative to governments. You've got a $10,000 per hectare asset, and it earns the government, without taking the externalities into the positive externalities, about $100 a year. So the opportunity cost is always in favor of conversion to something else. And we've got to value those assets, as the World Bank is doing, in innovative ways, in a much more positive way, and make the business case for that landscape transformation. Because sadly, when we think about, well, if governments are not being able to see the revenue coming from a forest area, and there's a conversion or letting it go, they don't know what to do with it, particularly in the developing world, then we're saying, well, now we've got some degraded forest landscapes, we're wanting to restore them back to the place where the governments didn't know how to manage them anyway. We've got to get in place much more innovative business cases to make it work. And as Jennifer said, it's going to be connecting those different types of capital and people understanding their roles. And that's the key part of it. Because it is two things, two closing points, I would say, and hopefully both tweetable. The first one relates to climate change. Is it 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees? If we end up with a 4-degree world, we're going to have a four-letter outcome. And we've really got to get serious about it. It is really important to think about that and get really serious about it. I think the second issue is that how are we going to step up and connect and mobilize those things? And it's going to be, to Jennifer's second point, and that is, how do we come together to design things? How do we come together to be in the same jurisdiction or location? And how do we leverage all of that $1, $3, $6, $24, $35, $1,000 together? And that will come through co-design, co-location, and co-investment. And once we start thinking about those three principles, I think we will solve many of the problems that we have.
Thank you. So we need to go fast, we need to go wide, we need to put everybody together, but still not happening. So, Jennifer, why do you think yourself it's not happening?
Right. It might be because we have to do some boring things too, to be very honest. And some of those boring things were mentioned. It's like doubling down on some of the emerging fund managers, like Athelia, where for some investors, that might not be as alluring from an impact point of view, because your impact return, sure, is the businesses that Athelia is investing in, but it's also leverage. It's also strengthening that fund manager. It's also proving out that asset class, that it's investable, not just by your potential more philanthropic dollars, but it's also investable for the private capital markets. And for some people, that rubs a little boring. You don't get to pet the bunny, right? You're investing in a fund. We even have a very hard time explaining what's in our portfolio. We lend to funds. And now people are appreciating that if we can systematically build the infrastructure in sectors and then change the whole dialogue because businesses can evolve and scale, then we really have made lasting change. And so that investment's very powerful. But at first blush, investing in infrastructure is rather boring. So I think we have to do some boring things too to really get us going at a scale and a pace that can really be meaningful. That's not just kind of keeping us in a steady state. Another thing I would argue is that there's sometimes a lack of appreciation of the gap between the work we do and what traditional capital is willing to invest in. I mentioned it, that they like things in boxes that they understand, that look familiar to them. But I'll give you an example around scale. I'm in many situations when a scale project is 20, 25, 30 million. For the capital markets, that doesn't even fly into the conversation of scale. That's boutique. That's maybe interesting for one client if they really push hard. But as said, it's not going to be on the eyeballs of institutional clients or larger pools of assets because it's simply not scaled. For them, scale, $500 million really becomes interesting. So we sometimes use words that mean very different things for us doing the work here and what the traditional markets is looking for. And how do we get there is we have to think about how we bundle some of this work up, I think, and product it. kind of package it so that you can create access into these types of investments for the scaled capital. And that goes back to some of the boring work that I was mentioning before.
So, Tony, what is the boring things that you are going to do?
Yeah. You don't seem like a boring guy.
Well, I wouldn't include attending GLF forums as a boring thing. It is a great...
Unless you don't want to be invited again.
It is a great networking event. And, I think as we come together and not just tick off the sexy things, but think about the legwork behind it. We're a research and development organization. And for 40 years, we've collected data and evidence and analyses and technical solutions and social solutions, policy solutions. We've got a legacy of $1.2 billion funded by many donors and foundations. $1.2 billion. And those are fantastic knowledge products. But unless we transform those into knowledge service, into design input, into decision support, into delivery options, into capacity development, then we've missed out. That knowledge will sit on the shelf. And that transformation is a great opportunity. And we think it's boring having all of those boffins do that science and research behind the background, but it's not. And then, as Howard Shapiro says, those uncommon collaborations where you bring players that have never worked together. And also, that's not boring. I mean, anything can either be boring or fun. But coming together and thinking about how we mobilize these different actors and these different players. We spoke about the value chains and many of them being blocked and these commodities. Well, I think blockchain is one of the ways we can unblock a lot of those value chains. And it's going to be very exciting hearing some of the new technologies and new opportunities for those immutable processes to link back to the individual landscapes. And so that the investors in the room and others can see that link between keeping the natural capital. It takes 100 years to build up 2 centimeters of topsoil. 100 years. We can lose that in a single rainfall event. So we've got to be very careful with this natural capital assets we have and leverage those for these transformations and thinking about how capital, the financial capital, fits into that natural capital space.
Michael, are you going to stitch the boring part of research and development and the boring part of finance?
Yes. So I'd love to believe that we're a little organization, but I'd love to believe that we are about research and action, kind of like you are. So one of the things we do is we have something called the Ecosystem Marketplace. And what we do is basically track all of these emerging environmental markets, because this is going to be a really important piece of the puzzle in the future. Think of it as like what Bloomberg did for finance markets. We want to be the Bloomberg of environmental markets. So that's the boring stuff, tracking that information. So this community can say, oh, wow, carbon markets this year were up, or look what's going on with water in Peru, all that kind of stuff. But the action part of it is when you think about that research and you figure out how you can stitch together all of the agents that need to be in the same room. So you have a growing group of businesses that have all committed to no net deforestation in their supply chains. 800 of them globally. Great thing, great thing. But we haven't figured out a way to make that commitment become an investment in those forests. Right now they're just saying, let's just take deforestation out. But there are some wonderful examples of where those commodities, if you can be creative and if you can be a little bit out of the box, you can think about how you can invest that kind of capital into the affirmative part of the equation, which are green jurisdictions. I don't know if Dan Nepstead is here, but we work with them very closely at II and thinking about some of these green jurisdictions like Mato Grosso, like Acre, like Kalimantan, that are trying to become areas where you can do sustainable development and attract that kind of capital. But it's going to take the stitching of, again, leadership from the World Bank, leadership from the multi-development agencies, the DFIs, coupled with these businesses that are making this commitment to create that stitching. And it's like the architecture of finance. I think about it that way rather than a continuum, but you need to have that architecture from, bonds, green global bonds that are tracking that, down to payments to farmers in places like Mato Grosso.
Because for the time, but I've been given a few more minutes. So how can we then sort of, we all clearly, Jennifer, you said that innovation is not necessarily what you need, maybe breaking silos. We need to do boring things. How can we put that together so that how can you think out of the box from a forestry's perspective and still fit into the box of the traditional market? So that's sort of, how do you create the links between, because that's what we have been trying to do, and we are not there. So the last question I'm asking the three of you, and you have something like 2.5 seconds to answer, how you create this, how you make innovative things outside of the box, fitting in a very rigid, conservative, and risk-averse system.
For us, we've gained a lot of traction lately by simply having people working with us that have deep capital markets experience. Having worked in the markets and understanding what the markets need and want, you need that expertise around the table when you're developing structures, developing product. And what we're looking to do when we do that type of work is always an eye to how replicable is that structure in other geographies, in other sectors. So we very much avoid trying to innovate to the point of losing the essence of the financial integrity. And we've been at fault at doing this sometimes. Sometimes some assets that we invest in do not provide a market return. They just simply don't. And we have tried to mop up that truth by putting in a lot of soft capital to provide a higher yield to the senior or the private capital. That sets wrong expectations. And that we have been guilty of, I'll be very honest, in the past. I think we're struggling with that reality too as we've come into the work around oceans and thinking about sustainable fisheries. You can't, right? How do you monetize a fish? And that question, I think we don't sometimes create true honesty with ourselves. This is where sometimes we push finance too far and create a business solution for every issue. So that, I think, is one piece, maybe a little bit of a downer to end on. My apologies. Tony, I hope you can do better in leaving us in a more productive place or a upward-leaning place.
Tony?
2 quick points. First one is, I think, the risk-reward ratio. And we're not really on top of those risk-to-reward ratios. And our risks, when we try and manage them with standards and criteria, we've over-engineered it if we have 200 criteria, we've under-engineered it if we've just got 1 or 2. And we've got to think about managing those risks to drive that reward. And when we think about reward, there's always winners and losers. And unless we are taking that ESG approach and making sure that as much as possible, there's more of a win-win, when there's that conflict, when there's that difference, we'll continue to end up with that disconnect. Now, conceptually, and Thomas Venn of the Venn diagram fame might have a problem with this, but if you're trying to think inside one box and outside another, I think the only way to do it is with nested boxes. So that you can be inside one box, and that's inside a bigger nest, and inside a bigger nest, and that largest box is our landscape. And how we fit into that landscape and try and not be separate and somewhere else, but be together and nested and integrated is the challenge for all of us for the rest of today.
Michael?
Yeah, no, I would go back to, I think what we have been beating our heads against for the last 30 years is, how do you really create an asset class? That's what we want to do. If forests and sustainable land use are asset classes, we won't have to have this meeting again because finance will flow to it. But to remember that, when we, 20 years ago, renewable energy was out of the box. It was risky. It was all of these things. So let us go down that path of creating an asset class. And let's take advantage of the the finance expertise that Jen is an example of, but to help us do that and just be very deliberate about it. And, you know, Laura and the World Bank and others in this room that are in a position to say, that's a priority, that's a mission of the institution to have that happen. That's going to have so many co-benefits, including climate and water and biodiversity and communities and livelihoods. That should be our mission together.
Thank you. We have go beyond our time, but I think it was very important. Let's thank again Jennifer and our two panelists. It was very interesting. Now, we are going to move into a discussion forum, and there are 3 discussion forums. One here in this room, and 2 in the L101 and 103. And you have something like a quarter of a second to go there. So thanks a lot, and let's continue this day.